Section 18 of Richelieu by George Joseph Gustave Masson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 6, Administration and Police, Part 4. Meanwhile, a movement of a much more serious kind was taking place in Normandy, and the rebels of that province, under the designation of Va-nu-pieds, had put to death a great many of the collectors of the taxes, burnt down their houses, and destroyed both their property and the offices where the money was wont to be paid. What could be expected from the army of suffering, armée de souffrance, who knew the government but as a grinding machine on a huge scale, deaf to the cries of woe and extorting the last sou, the smallest article of furniture, from those who could not afford to buy so much as a loaf of bread? Rouen became the scene of the most serious tumult. The whole Parliament, in their robes, interfered energetically for the protection of Le Tellier de Tourneville, Receiver General of the gabelle, and his officers, and they sent a deputation to Paris with the view both of informing His Majesty of the state of things and of obtaining from him military aid. This application was immediately answered, but it proved fatal to the Rouen magistrates, who were charged with having allowed the insurrection to spread and gain day by day an amount of strength which might easily have been stopped at first by a determined course of action. Colonel Gassion, well known for his sternness of character as well as by his military qualities, was sent down into Normandy. We must not compare these seditions with the medieval Jacquerie directed against the lords and barons. In the present case, the hatred of the mob had for its object the salt warehouses or the custom houses. No wonder. In days of yore it was the baron who ground down his vassals. Now it was the king who, through the medium of his delegates, fleeced his subjects and reduced them to poverty. The proximate cause of the insurrection in the district of Avranches and at Caen was the prohibition of white salt, which the people till then had uniformly used. In the northern part of the province it was the establishment of a duty, droit de marque, on broadcloths. Bills pasted up throughout the country called the people to arms for the defence and freedom of the land oppressed by the tax collectors and custom house officers. The Bishop of Avranches tells us that instead of saying Domine salvum fac regem, his diocesans chanted Domine salvum fac gregem. It was on behalf of the people that help from heaven was most needed. An edict re-establishing the salt tax and the election of Valognes, Avranches, Mortain, Coutances, and Carentan had been sent to the Cour des Aides at Caen to be registered. The judges could not agree as to the necessity and propriety of the measure. It had been accordingly postponed. Still the odious tax seemed likely to be enforced, and the people were in a great state of irritation about it. In the month of July 1639, Charles de Poupenel, Lord of La Bernardière, magistrate at Coutances, visiting Avranches on business connected with his office, was suspected of having come for the express purpose of establishing the gabelle. The peasants of the neighbourhood were so thoroughly persuaded that such was his design, especially as his brother-in-law farmed the salt tax, that they gathered round the house where he lodged, broke the door open, and put him to death, as well as 2 of his servants. The army of the Va-nu-pieds, amounting to upwards of 20,000 men, was commanded, it is reported, by a curé of the country. Their standard represented a black anchor with an image of St. John the Baptist and the motto Fuit homo missus ad Deo, cui nomen erat Johannes. The leader of this strange force sent circulars all over the province with the direction that they should be read on Sundays from the pulpit of every parish church. He apologized to the magistrates of certain districts for not having visited them yet, announcing at the same time that he would soon come and deliver them from the new taxes. All those established since the reign of Henry IV. Were to be done away with, and whilst the persons supposed to have had anything to do with the extortions ordered by Richelieu were sought out and punished, no harm whatever was done either to the magistrates or to the other officers of the crown. In some localities it was believed that these were even, if not directly, helping the rebels, at any rate taking purposely no action against them. Thus M. de Matignon in Lower Normandy, and M. de Canessy, governor of Avranches. The fact is that all right-minded gentilshommes knew to what a state of misery the poor people were reduced, and could not help sympathizing with them. Gassion arrived about the month of November at the head of 8 regiments of infantry and several companies of cavalry. Leaving at Vernon and at Les Andelys a detachment of 500 men, he marched immediately upon Caen, which was disarmed. Along with Gassion went a magistrate intendant, who was attached to the staff, and whose business it was to try and condemn the rebels. Several of these were hung untried. Others were broken alive on the rack, and their bodies afterwards cut up in pieces. They died, says an eye-witness, without showing any signs of repentance for their rebellion. And the multitude looked on silently, but sympathizing evidently with the unfortunate victims. The inhabitants of Caen had to pay a war contribution of 60,000 livres. Gassion then marched toward Avranches, where the army of the Va-nu-pieds had taken up its position. He arrived there about the middle of December. Avranches, built on the summit of a hill, was surrounded at that time by strong walls. The rebels were entrenched in an excellent position, holding one of the suburbs halfway up the hill between the ramparts and the sands of Mont Saint-Michel. Instead of waiting for the approach of the royal forces, they divided themselves into 2 companies. The one kept the barricades, whilst the other advanced towards the banks of a river which crosses the usual Avranches road, and at the passage of which they reckoned upon meeting Gassion's army. He, however, reached the city by another side, fell unexpectedly on the rebels, and ordered his men to carry the entrenchments. Despite their small number, the Va-nu-pieds stood their ground and received the troops with a heavy discharge of musketry. The soldiers drove the mob from the suburbs. They lost 5 privates and 7 or 8 officers, including the Marquis de Courtormais, who was shot down whilst in the act of encouraging his men. A great many of the rebels were killed in the action. Some met with their death by drowning, whilst endeavouring to escape to Mont Saint-Michel by the sands. A few more, taken prisoners, were hung on the spot. At Coutances and Elbeuf the insurrection was also put down with the utmost severity, and when on the 31st of December 1639 the troops entered Rouen, there was nothing to do but to try the ringleaders and send them to the gallows. Chancellor Séguier had come in person to superintend the proceedings. None of these disorders, said the representative of the government, would have happened but for the cowardice and connivance of those who had the authority and power to prevent them. The magistrates were held responsible for the damage done to the towns, and the gentilshommes for that committed in the country districts. Orders were given to draw up a list of those persons who had absented themselves during the riots, and to deliver that list into the hands of the Chancellor. This summary way of dealing reminds us of the famous Loi des Suspects, passed during the worst times of the Revolution, and there is no doubt whatever that some of the measures decreed by the magistrates were perfectly lawful and justifiable, as when, for instance, the Cour des Aides prohibited the raising of taxes if the edicts ordering these taxes to be paid had not been duly registered. But Richelieu's sic volo was at that time held supreme, and it is a wonder that he did not think fit to adopt the propositions of his creature Séguier, who suggested that the city of Rouen should be levelled with the ground. At any rate, Gassion's army was quartered upon the habitants, and a system of terror strictly carried out soon illustrated in the strongest manner all the vices of absolute government. The gallows remained en permanence, so to say. The executions were numerous, both in Upper and in Lower Normandy, and the Parliament of Rouen, ordered to leave the town at once, were replaced pro tempore by a body of 15 councillors selected from the Parliament of Paris. We need scarcely add that the whole province had to pay the heaviest taxes, Rouen alone being assessed to the amount of 3 millions. This put an end not to the dissatisfaction, but to outward expressions of it, in the shape of popular risings, and the Parliament, on its being allowed to meet again, took good care not to incite Richelieu's indignation, either by remissness in its duties or by assuming ideas of independence. On the subject of trade, commerce, and maritime operations in general, we can speak more favourably. Previous to the siege of La Rochelle, it could scarcely be said that France possessed a navy. After each expedition, the ships belonging to the state came into a harbour, where it was supposed that they remained under the care of their respective captains. There they stood completely neglected, and when wanted again for use, it was a long time before they could be put into repair, collected together, and efficiently manned. In the year 1629, Richelieu instructed an able engineer named d'Infreville to visit all the ocean seaboard, and to select the most convenient spots for the construction of 3 arsenals. D'Infreville immediately started on his tour of inspection, and surveyed in the greatest detail the coast between Calais and Bayonne. His report, which has been published, embodies a large number of the most valuable particulars on the maritime forces of that part of France, the collecting of the custom house dues, the arming and fitting out of the ships, the means of defence of the harbours, the spirit of the inhabitants, the number of persons employed in the trade with Africa and America, the amount of sailors, pilots, carpenters, captains, etc., etc. The places he had selected for the erection of the 3 arsenals were Brouage, Le Havre, and Brest. He explained in detail the various sources which were at the disposal of the government towards the formation of a navy, and he recommended to the Cardinal the illustrious Duquesne. It is wonderful to notice the promptness with which Richelieu availed himself of d'Infreville's suggestions and carried them out. In doing so, he found a most efficient coadjutor in Soublé de Noailles, and thanks to the energetic measures of those 2 men, the trade between France and foreign countries reached a state of prosperity it had never known before. The government concluded treaties of commerce with most nations, and favoured as much as it could the organisation of companies for the purpose of colonial trade. Efficient steps were also taken to determine and place on a proper footing the position of the agents whose business it was to protect French merchants in foreign countries. The earliest regulations respecting the establishment of consulates belong to that epoch. It is much to be regretted that Richelieu should have allowed French influence to dwindle away in the Levant. On the other hand, he did his best to render the Mediterranean traffic more secure than it had ever been, and he endeavoured to obtain a new outlet for French enterprise in northern parts by making negotiations with Russia, Denmark, and Sweden. It is not too much to say that when Richelieu arrived at power, the army stood in as much need of reform as the navy. The civil and religious wars of the 16th century had indeed kept up the military spirit of the nation, but had thoroughly demoralized the troops. Irregularly paid, and often receiving no pay at all, the soldiers thought that they were amply justified in indemnifying themselves by pillage. They treated in this respect those whom they professed to defend exactly as they did their enemies, and they rather reasonably asserted that they did not feel bound to observe the discipline established by a king who did not provide for their wants. In addition to this sad result, the wars of religion had also revived the science of tactics. When war consists of small skirmishes, battles on a diminutive scale, surprises and coups de main, you may train excellent chiefs of partisans, but you can scarcely expect to have a general in the proper sense of the word. The ignorance of the science of war which prevailed in France during the early part of the 17th century has been noticed by several writers, Fontenay-Mareuil and Talmont des Reillots, for example. There was a time, says the latter, when the only real generals were Marshal de Chatillon and Marshal de la Force. Ignorance was so universal that at the siege of Saint-Jean d'Angely, 1641, no one could be found who knew how to make a trench. This deficiency of commanders was soon and gloriously made up during the mighty war waged by Richelieu against the House of Austria. In that branch of the administration, therefore, as in most of the others, everything had to be done, and Richelieu prepared the way for his successors. After the death of Henry IV, the resources of the state were exhausted. Disciplined troops could no longer be collected together. The generals were incapacitated by old age and infirmities. The genius of one man sufficed for everything. He created armies, so to say, met all the various exigencies which war requires, and found commanders of unquestionable talent, who distinguished themselves amongst the best generals of the 17th century: Rohan, Créqui, d'Harcourt, Guébriant, Condé, and Turenne. The suppression of the important dignity of constable is one of Richelieu's attempts to put down the power of the aristocracy. In addition to lucrative privileges and a very high pay, the constable enjoyed, so far as the army was concerned, an authority superior to that of the king, or very nearly so. The office was done away with at the death of the Duc de Lesdiguières in 1627, and henceforward the marshals of France exercised in their own name the jurisdiction which they had been previously supposed to hold by virtue of a delegation from the constable. The almost uninterrupted wars which Louis XIII had to wage during his reign made it imperative for Richelieu to bring about reforms of every kind in the various branches of the military service: recruiting, victualling, paying, formation of the different regiments, ambulances, and hospitals. There was no detail neglected, no want overlooked, and the result was the splendid army which won the victories of Rocroi, Lens, Turckheim, and Rheinfeld. End of section 18.